Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Pad. I am the peacemonger. Today is Friday, the 27th of February. The month has almost ended. Where did it go? I've got slightly camera issues, so I'm using a different camera, so the angle may look a bit different from normal, for which I apologize. But welcome. If you're finding these podcasts interesting and helpful, thought-provoking, then please do like and subscribe to this channel. All of your support is very gratefully received. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Alexander Grable to the show. Now, Alexander came to my attention on X. Somebody commented favorably on a presentation he did at a university in Finland about casualty numbers. Now, the mainstream media narrative is that Russia's losing 10 or even 27 times more troops on the battlefield than Ukraine. And of course, this helps kind of keep the war momentum moving forward. Alexander has a different view. He's a PhD student. He's left his civil service career to kind of study towards a PhD at King's College in London. He's British despite his American accent. Alexander, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So tell us about the origins of your, before we get into the casualty data, tell us about the origins of your research that you're doing towards your PhD.
Well, I think like everybody else, I was very, very shocked and horrified when Russia launched its invasion on 24 February 2022. I think we all got the sense looking at the images that a point in history had been reached and nothing would ever be the same again after this, that the world would fundamentally be reshaped by it. So naturally, I began to follow the war quite closely, sticking initially very much with Western and Ukrainian sources. But also, I had from my education, from my undergraduate, from my master's degree, and also a month spent abroad, thanks to my master's degree at Moscow at the Russian Foreign Ministry's school, MGIMO, which is the Moscow State Institute for International Affairs, as if I'm translating that correctly.
Moskovский государственный институт международных дел.
Mm,
Международные отношения.
Отношения. Точно. Yes, that, and also my reading, of course, of World War II history, that, well, this doesn't seem right and is shocking, but I think that the thing that made me open my mind the most about I needed to look more carefully and find some Russian sources if I could, and therefore take a more holistic view, would have been the 26 February 2022 Facebook post by Ukrainian Special Operations Command, where they said that they wouldn't take any Russian artillerymen prisoners anymore. They would just shoot them. And I thought, okay, that is very alarming that you're saying that you're not going to comply with the law of armed conflict. And then it hit me again a month later when the Malaya Rogan massacre happened. You might remember that, where the captured Russian soldiers were taken out, then all shot behind their kneecaps and left to bleed to death. And then that General Zaluzhny, after, I'm forgetting his name, Arestovich, promised that we will look into this, this is very serious, that Zaluzhny said nothing would happen, and that this is all Russian propaganda anyway. It's like, right, well, an army that doesn't comply with the law of armed conflict and boasts that it doesn't comply with the law of armed conflict clearly has some other things going on here, so once again, need to look at this more closely. Then when you actually look at Russian sources, which others don't, you see all sorts of things happening to the Ukrainians that Ukrainian sources naturally don't show, nor did our own media show. And as time went on, watching it day after day of eventual interest, I realized, well, it seems to me that the Russians are using, per even our own admissions, far more firepower. They know how to use it. Their forces are decently trained. And also, even if that is just their propaganda is not, we can commit war crimes and get away with it. It is, we are a buttoned-down professional army that is disciplined, that sticks to our rules and regulations and complies with the laws of wars. Might be propaganda, probably almost certainly is, but nonetheless it indicates a certain attitude and a desire to display military professionalism, at least publicly, that that's the image that they want you to see, that they want people to think of them, and also that they want to think of themselves. Which indicates, if nothing else, at least a baseline respect for training and military professionalism and discipline. And another big opening event that led us to this in casualties was who here among your listeners, and I'm sure you do, remembers the 2022 Kherson offensive?
Yeah, of
Um,
course. Yeah.
we will get to that. It's relevant for my broader calculations, which is that, yes, a lot of Ukrainian armor burning out on the steppe, very brave men charging over largely open fields, but being spotted by Russian drones, targeted by Russian artillery, helicopter gunships, airstrikes, and then even when they got close to Russian positions, often not being able to overwhelm them because the Russian infantry was very capably led and equipped, and they fought back well, held their positions, and also were able to call in airstrikes and artillery to protect themselves from being overrun. Um, and we also know, most indicatively, when the Russians withdrew from that city, that the Ukrainians, who are normally very aggressively, constantly under the attack, want to get the invader off their land, were afraid to pursue the Russians. That normally doesn't happen and indicates something very awful must have happened to them, which would mesh with all the anecdotal evidence that you could observe in Russian social media and the Russian press from what was happening to them. And in fact, there was a very hair-raising article. I forget on the exact date, but it's in September 2022 in the Washington Post, where they interviewed a soldier who'd been Ukrainian soldier who'd been injured in that offensive, and he estimated that for every one Russian they made a casualty, killed or wounded, the Ukrainians lost five. Um, and so, therefore, when the June 2023 counteroffensive happened, and we all saw those surprising images, but if you were paying close attention, not shocking, of NATO armor, Leopards and Bradleys all piled together in one big scrum, burning on the steppe, that therefore the shock that could be seen in the mainstream media indicated that there was, and the actual shock, as in they didn't quite know how to narrate this or to process this or to inform people about this, that somebody needed to go back to the beginning of the war and to examine the entire period to inform people, and especially inform ourselves, because this is relevant for the defense of NATO and the defense of the United Kingdom, that we are informed about this as best as we can and that we get this right. That this outcome not only was not surprising, it should have been expected. The only unexpected thing was how poorly the Ukrainians performed in that assault, which I was taken aback by, quite frankly, but not that the Russians stopped them. And therefore, everything since then follows a certain logic. If you look at history, if you look at how the Russians actually fight this war, and if you consider the very well known and acknowledged material firepower advantages, albeit they're in the mainstream media and some of the other publications, they get around that by pretending that the Ukrainians have an advantage, but I don't see, as we can get into, how they can calculate that. But it means that the Ukrainians are on the wrong side of the attritional gradient, and with a smaller population, that means they will lose the war, and if they not only lose the war, they could, if their army is sufficiently degraded, lose it badly. And nobody, and I don't even think the Russians, want to see a scenario where the Ukrainian military and with it the Ukrainian state collapses. That is the worst case scenario that I think everybody, especially in the West, should want to avoid.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet, the mainstream narrative is dominated by Ukraine's remarkable successes against the Russians, non-stop. I mean, there have been some limited counteroffensives in Zaporizhia recently over pretty unpopulated land, it has to be said. But nevertheless, they've made incursions into kind of Russian-controlled sort of areas there non-stop. I mean, the Kursk offensive, of course, that was again across farmland, mostly farmland. Stunning victory. All of the time, we're being whipped up into a frenzy by Ukraine's military prowess, while at the same time Zelensky says they don't have enough weapons. And as you rightly point out, or before we came online, they're having to busify Ukrainians to actually go to the front line because it's harder for them to mobilize new recruits. Uh, what do you think is behind it? Why do you think the media is kind of shaping this narrative, which appears to be manifestly untrue, or at least doesn't survive contact with the evidence?
From one civil servant to another, but also to the audience, you well know that you serve the government of the day and their policies, and the imperative is to support Ukraine, and therefore the idea is to generate that Ukraine can win. And how can it win given that Russia has this reputation as this somewhat overwhelming force and has a clearly much larger population and economy? Well, it must be because they're just so much better that they can that you don't need to look at how many troops, how many guns, the capabilities of the weapon systems, or how they're employed are. All you need to know is that thanks to the magic of NATO training and supposedly loving freedom, we can get into that. That will make this victory possible. It tells a story that is very flattering to ourselves because that's what we want to believe about ourselves. But in large part, I think it's informed by how we think of the Russians, which is that there tend to be cast, as you can see, even in this idea of the Russians are losing 15 or 27 to 1, is there this dark other that doesn't value human life. But I think any examination, even of Soviet era movies, once Stalin had done us all a favor and died, indicates that the there actually is quite a bit of a culture of mourning of the value of an individual life in Russia. And yes, the necessity of sacrifice and death are accepted in war, but that does not indicate indifference, and it does not indicate a desire to throw oneself away. In fact, one of the messages, a lot of the messages in those movies are constantly do not throw your life away. Don't be a bloody hero. Be smart. Um, but we don't think about it that way because then it would be somewhat discomforting to think that, oh, well, the Russians are a modern developed people much like ourselves, because how could a modern developed people like ourselves do such a ghastly thing? Need to nuance that, though. We can get into details, but there's a lot of this sort of way of looking at the Russians as being completely other, as opposed to, of course, being different to us. The Russians are not us. They are a different people with a different culture, but being human beings and also being from a general European and even Western milieu, they're not so different to us. They're not
Yeah,
alien.
no, they're not. I mean, I lived there for 4.5 years, as you know, and I found them remarkably warm. People once you get to know them, incredibly warm, generous. The group is a very important driver of within society. Friendship groups less individualistic, I'd say, in general terms. Compared to certainly the British. But as I've said before, you can say the French are different from the British too, right? The Germans, and so on. But they are different. But yeah, we do portray them as inhumane, cold-hearted beasts, which was even Putin himself. I'm not saying I'm a Putin supporter by any means, but he's driven by very powerful emotions. But that means he has emotions, right? And I think that's the Russians love hard and fight harder. They wouldn't have produced Tolstoy, Tchaikovsky, and all these kind of cultural greats if they were heartless savages. Quite frankly, and to cast them in that light is just it's frankly kind of shameful. But as you say, it does help us to kind of maintain this impression of them that justifies us continuing a war because we have to defeat these savages. I mean how different are Ukrainians from Russians? Really, when it comes down to it. I mean, they're Slavs too. Of course, they have their own unique identity as well. I get that, their own language. Totally understand that too. But I mean, that Ukrainians and Russians are closer to each other than Russians. The Ukrainians are to the British. Not that many matters. Of course. But demonizing the other while claiming, Ukraine is exceptionally European is just a bizarre is just a bizarre fabrication, it seems to me. What do you think?
Well, also here's the other reason it is bizarre, and it's important to bear in mind. One thing, for example, that is used to say that Russia has historically been inept is, oh, the Russians lost the Russo-Japanese War to the Japanese. But as I think anybody who is both American or British, and I'm both, so I get to feel this pain twice, is very aware at the beginning of our war with the Japanese in World War II, we were handled very, very roughly by the Japanese because the Japanese were and are a modern, sophisticated people who had fully absorbed, um, one might dare to say this, the Western modern way of war, simply because Western military structures were, um, after about 1600, the most efficient on planet Earth at generating efficient and effective military power, and they used it very effectively to inflict very sharp defeats on us, often while inflicting heavier casualties on us, even though the United States and the UK were far more industrial, far more modern, and their armed forces were better equipped and better fed than the Japanese. So one should not just assume that just because somebody is not aligned with us or is Western, that they can't defeat you. If they have a modern military system and that they know what they're doing, they most imperatively can, and they have. Um, but yes, so therefore, it is very strange to me when you think about it. The point, a basis of my presentation is therefore on that basis that is the military demonstrably tactically competent? As in, if you watch its combat actions, and unfortunately, thanks to social media, we can now watch more closely and intimately this war than almost any other war in human history, I think. Um, then if they demonstrate basic effectiveness, then unfortunately, basic solid competence, then unfortunately, numbers come into play. And that doesn't mean numbers of men as much as it means the number of machines, the quality of your machines, but also the amount of the just sheer tonnage of high explosive that you can deploy. If you can deploy it accurately on target, high explosive is king. We well know this as Brits from the First World War that artillery was the major killer of our troops, and vice versa with what we did to the Germans. And if the Russians have, as is acknowledged, a lot more artillery, they can drop, according to the Ukrainians, 30 times as many bombs as they can. And when I last looked, the Ukrainians do claim drone superiority, but they said that they produced 3 million drones to the Russians having 2 million drones. Well, that's not a crushing superiority and wouldn't allow you to kill 10 times or 27 times as many of the enemy as others, and that would be ignoring all the other factors. And the Russians claim that they use twice as many drones as the Ukrainians, so it depends on who you believe. Then, if both sides are basically competent, the one with a lot more firepower is going to deal a lot more damage and is going to win, which is also why, if anybody watches my presentation, I use historical examples. In the UK and the US, in large part thanks to 1940, and also because for various, often illogical reasons, we appear not to like them. I don't know why. We don't think much of the French army, but we do think a lot very highly of the German army. And that's why I emphasized examples from World War One, where the French not only inflicted heavier casualties on the Germans, but in the case of Malmaison, inflicted an absolutely humiliating, lopsided defeat on the Germans. So if somebody who we don't think much of the martial prowess of very well, like the French, can do that to somebody who we think very highly of, the Germans, we should not at all get emotional about this. We should think very coolly and logically grounded in facts and what can be confirmed and observed about what is happening. And if it means that our friends and our allies, the Ukrainians, are on the wrong side of that, it might be very distressing. It is very distressing to watch. You had Marta Gavrishko on your program, and she spoke very well about the horrors of bussification. You've also had Ivan Kachanovsky on, and I know that he's spoken out on X about what has happened to some members of his family in this war. But the fact is that they're on the wrong side of that. What you then do with that is up to you, but to insist everything is fine and to then stick a magic integer on the number of casualties you're inflicting is doing a service to nobody except, ironically, the Russians, because I think the Russians are quite happy to have us in some sort of magical thinking or delusion, because that way we can keep making mistakes, which suits Gerasimov very well, but I don't think, for example, it serves the UK very well if we want to believe what we want to believe as opposed to what can be observed and thinking about things clearly.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing about the Russians is that they're very calm in their calculations, particularly when it comes to warfare, but in general about most things. You know, that they tend to kind of favor logic and rational analysis. And despite their tempestuous characters, in matters of war, that they, you know, the practicalities of war, the bloody brutality of war, they're very much driven by their heads, not their hearts, it seems to me. Whereas I'm not saying the Ukrainians aren't either, or indeed that Western militaries aren't either, but the narrative of the war is very much driven by on for the West at least is very much driven by emotional considerations. Ukraine is right and Russia is wrong, and Putin's a war criminal. Why should we deal with him? And no real consideration to the actual realities and the facts on the ground, which are dismissed, because that they collide with, the emotional torment that we feel and our kind of desire to kind of help the Ukrainians. I've likened it before to a grief cycle. We're in the denial phase of grief. We can't bear to engage with the possibility that actually our project, I trying to defeat Russia, is dead. We're clinging on to the hope that it's still alive, despite the observable evidence that actually it really is dead.
Um,
So we're driven by emotional considerations.
One thing I think, however, since you brought me on, that your listeners would probably want is for me to present some of my data because you've talked about my presentation.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
and in terms of observable reality, so I talked a bit about it with Kherson, but let's look at what I actually presented. And I started with the
Yes.
bottom line up front, which is that official data is very, very hard to come by in this war. But thanks to Sergeant Zhelayev, we have official disclosures quite against their will from the Russians, and we have official disclosures from the Ukrainians. Now, I've gotten some pushback against this, and I think the best pushback I got was, well, the Ukrainians are so tight-lipped about everything else. Why would they disclose their amputee numbers all of a sudden? That's very strange. But um, the Ukrainians, per officially confirmed data that we can know and verify, have 28 times at least as many amputees as the Russians. That tells its own story. Um, and again, given that the Russian data we got was from a leak that most certainly the Russians didn't want because they prize military secrecy. It's the basis of Soviet military culture. Yes, the Russian military is very different from the Soviet military, but the senior officers, such as Gerasimov, grew up in and were socialized in the Soviet military. So a lot of those ethoses of, that's what a good officer does. He keeps secrets tight, and also for good operational reasons, which is that you don't want the enemy to know how weak or how strong you are. So even if the leak somewhat actually looks good for them, you still don't want such information out there. And it had to have been verified to have been released. But it tells its own story. But if you look at the higher end Ukrainian numbers, the Ukrainians have more like 35 amputees to every one Russian amputee. Does this mean that they have 35 times as many casualties? I don't believe that. But it tells its own story um, of suffering and horror. Why use such morbid figures? Well, very sadly, because when you lose a limb, it, like when you lose a life, is gone forever. But therefore, it's harder to hide. Also, casualties in war can get very squishy because the same man can unfortunately be wounded more than once. So, how many wounded you have gets kind of squishy. So, go with something that's more sadly permanent. Um, and yes, looking at historical data, you can know, looking at conflicts, of this many men were killed, this many men, because it normally is, but never ever was exclusively men, lost their limbs. And from that, there is a number of killed, a number of amputees. You can work out a ratio, and you can do that for different conflicts. So, what I did is I assumed I looked at the Russian data and assumed a bad scenario for the Russians, that their medical system is 60 years behind that of modern NATO medical systems. And I looked at Ukrainian data and assumed that they were up to NATO standards to get a kill to death ratio. What you get from the amputee figures, at least, these are not complete, I should stress, for a variety of reasons, because the database didn't include the Donbass rebels, but it did include Wagner, is that the Ukrainians have easily 10 times as many killed in action as the Russians. Quite frankly, that's a lot more believable for the very simple reason because we talked about bussification. The Russians are using volunteers by paying a lot of people a lot of money to turn up, sign up, and risk their lives as soldiers. The Ukrainians have to drag people off the streets and throw them into buses and beat them up to generate manpower. And men are allowed to leave Russia, but they're not allowed to leave Ukraine except under very special circumstances. Um, if the Russians were suffering 5 times as many casualties as the Ukrainians, given that Russia has about 5 times as many people as Ukraine, they would need to use the same expedients as the Ukrainians to generate manpower. They most manifestly don't. Whereas the Ukrainians have been resorting to these expedients not recently. This didn't start last year. This didn't start in 2024 or even 2023. It started in 2022. You can go onto Ukrainian social media and observe that draft officers often don't just have to hand out the notice. They have to physically grab men to restrain them even in 2022 to generate manpower for the front line. This wouldn't have happened if Ukraine was suffering light casualties even in 2022. But in 2023, and this is according to the Kiev Independent, and for these sorts of things you have to rely on Western and Ukrainian sources because, of course, the Russians are in this war. They're putting out propaganda. They can say anything that they want. According to the Ukrainians, the draft you might remember this controversy of the Ukrainians were going to lower the draft age from 27 to 25.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Well, that was the red herring because that wouldn't have generated much extra manpower. What was much more relevant in the legislation was, and this is off the top of my head, and you can check these things that they're from 25 and 27 October, if I remember correctly, these articles. What was more relevant was the exemptions they were removing. Among other things, that were the exemptions that were being removed that would exempt a Ukrainian man from the draft were if you were shorter than 140 centimeters, if you had certain heart conditions, if you were HIV positive, if you were missing 2 or more fingers, if you had an adrenaline deficiency. These are the sorts of measures that you resort to if you are absolutely desperate for manpower, and any manpower will do. They are not the sort of things that you do in a nation of 30 to 32 million people if you have only suffered 55,000 killed in action. It means that the situation has to be considerably worse, to which the amputee numbers speak their own story, irrespective of what the actual kill count is. That tells its own story right there. And another thing is that, very sadly, the amputee numbers about match the exchange ratio of killed Russians who are repatriated by the Ukrainians to Russia and killed Ukrainians.
Yeah.
About 28 to 1. Is that the ratio? I personally don't think so, because Ukraine would have collapsed if that had been the case. But it tells its own story. These are not the sorts of things taken all together that happening if Ukraine is suffering not just lighter but considerably lighter casualties than Russia. They do, however, suggest that one side is able to pay a lot of money to get volunteers, and the other has to resort to coercion. And it's not as though the Ukrainians have not tried to use the volunteer methods, but when they did that to get young men to sign up, only about 1,000 did. It's Volodymyr Ishchenko had a very good article on this program and its failure, but yes, it indicates that there is an implicit, if not explicit, knowledge in Ukraine about this. And one final point. Vadim Yevchenko, who sits on the National Security and Defense Council in the Rada, so Ukraine's parliament, said in November last year that up to 500,000 Ukrainians soldiers have died during the war. And when his interviewer pushed back on them, he said, "Well, that's a hypothetical. It could be higher." All these sorts of things do point together to the fact that Ukraine, in a war of attrition, is on the wrong side. And with a smaller population, that means, and it is very sad to say this, that it is losing the war and it is on the trajectory to be defeated sooner or later. But as you're a diplomat, this also would explain the Russian negotiating position. It's often framed as, oh, Putin is just being stubborn. Doesn't he recognize? Actually, no. Putin probably is informed by his generals and intelligence, and if I can put this together, an organization like the SVR certainly can, that we are on the right side of the attritional gradient. We are suffering significantly higher casualties, and we have insulated our economy far more from the effects of this war than the
Significantly
Ukrainians.
lower.
Time is on our side.
Yeah.
We can
Yeah.
hold. That's why we can hold on. We
I
can
think
get
you
the
meant
better deal.
significantly lower casualties.
Yeah, significantly lower.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I agree 100% with that. And I've said, many times that actually, Putin has more time on his side. That doesn't mean that he doesn't want to settle with a deal, because I believe that he does. I mean, it is a huge economic shock. I think they're navigating the economics far better than Ukraine, definitely, which is basically bankrupt, or Europe, which is kind of bleeding itself dry and deindustrializing. I think Russia's navigating the economic shock of war better. I think it'd been preparing for the economic shock of war for longer. I mean, I've done some research while I was at the MC in Moscow, suggesting that, that they were starting to kind of build up the reserves as early as late 2016, ready. And of course, half their reserves were expropriated, but they still had 300 billion left in the tank, and they now have 833. I think they've been preparing for that at the time. Since the war started, they started buying gold. You may have seen Valek Sikorsky's bizarre comment the other day about the Russians running out of gold. Utter nonsense, utter nonsense. But such is the nature of propaganda. But the point is, I mean, I think Putin would settle. He would settle for a peace deal, but it has to be on terms that he can agree to and sells success in Russia.
Uh,
Whenever you hear, let me finish. I was almost finished. You know, when you hear Europeans as one saying, well, Putin won't agree to a ceasefire, no, because he wants a peace deal. I mean, he doesn't want a ceasefire, he wants a peace deal. Something bigger, more strategic that, addresses longer term concerns and allows a proper normalization of peace on Europe, not just a pause button being pressed on a much bigger European war.
um, I can't but concur with what you say. Yes. Um, you, being the diplomat, would be much better versed on the diplomacy than I would and have the expertise in that. All I can say is what the military reality enables in terms of diplomatic options for Russia. But yes, I would say that just because I'm saying the Russians are suffering significantly lighter losses, that's my working hypothesis, than the Ukrainians, that does not mean that they're suffering light losses. This isn't a pleasant experience for Russia. Not at all. Please, nobody should understand that. And that would encourage the Russians to want to have a peace agreement. But that also means that they don't want to conquer all of Ukraine. And I know that is often said, but in addition to the fact that the Russians never said that, and I read Putin's July 2021 manifesto. It's a rather odd document, but I don't know how you could construe it to say that that means he wanted to conquer all of Ukraine. Um, but the even observing what the Russians say that they're doing on the front line, and even if you believe the Russian casualty figures that they point out, none of what they are reporting amounts to any sort of indication that they are determined to break through and just take land at any cost, but rather that they have a tempo of operations that currently they're comfortable with. But you mentioned Kursk as a great offensive. I watched that closely. It's also something else that I'm working on to maybe come out with an article. We'll see. And what wasn't shown was the Ukrainians. Have you ever seen the movie A Bridge Too Far?
Yes, yes, of course, yeah.
Do you remember the scene where the SS charge the bridge in that giant armored column, and then the paras just open up on them and devastate them?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The Ukrainians were wandering into several such ambushes as they advanced in Kursk from the Russians, and the aftermath looked exactly like it did at the end of that scene with the burning columns and the dead SS troopers. Quite equally gruesome. And we also know how it ended. When the Russians decided that they wanted to liquidate the pocket, General Lapin, the then Russian commander, was granted almost anything that he needed: the drones, the artillery, and the consistent firepower to push forward. And you remember that the pocket suddenly, it was slowly and then it collapsed all at once, suddenly and quickly. When the Russians decide to commit enough force that they decide they actually want to seize a certain amount of territory, they move quite quickly. But currently, they're content to grind forward nutritionally because one key objective that they have said that they want to fulfill, and it's something that I think for some reason people keep missing, even though they keep repeating it and saying this is what we are doing, and you can observe them doing it, is they want to demilitarize Ukraine. From their perspective, destroying Ukraine's ability to effectively reconstitute as a viable military threat to them through um, a very lopsided exchange ratio is fulfilling one of their objectives. And since, for example, in the UK, we don't make tanks anymore, goodness knows how that happened, given that we invented the tank. Um, yes, that means that some very finite NATO military power is being destroyed, and that gives them more hard power leverage over especially European NATO. Now, to go all the way would cost them a lot more that Putin would rather avoid that cost. But here's the question. Is it right and ethical for us to ask the Ukrainians to continue paying the sort of price that I have described? And should we really do that given what it's doing to us in this war? We are not bleeding out on the battlefield, but as you've mentioned, our economic difficulties. Well, is that really good for us to continue to do that, or should we think about this a bit differently, perhaps?
Yeah, of course, we shouldn't ask the Ukrainians to do it. We should have actually we should have encouraged Zelensky to take the Istanbul Agreement when he could in April of 2022. But of course, Boris Johnson, who was there on February the 24th with Alistair Campbell and that former Tory MP, there's in the Azov side, sort of
Hmm.
freak show that was happening. They just want to kind of build Zelensky up as a modern day Churchill, which is a likeness that a comparison which I absolutely despise because actually, well, first and foremost, Churchill was ruling over a coalition government, a government of national unity that had all of the main parties participating in it. Firstly, but I think the dynamic has changed that actually Zelensky now controls the war. No, nobody is willing to tell him that actually enough's enough and we need to draw it to a close. Where he was seen as a puppet at the start, when he came to power, even in the Foreign Office, we didn't see him as a serious figure compared to Poroshenko, for example. Now he pulls the strings, and will we give him everything that he wants? And actually, it's become a bit of a personality cult that we have to support Zelensky, and nobody's really thinking about Ukraine. Zelensky doesn't want to sue for peace. Why would he? I mean, politicians are driven by human emotions like everybody else, and his is personal survival and wealth. I don't know whether wealth accumulation's on his mind, but he certainly sort of governs over a fairly corrupt regime. The only difference from previous Ukrainian regimes is that he has access to vastly larger sums of cash, that have been provided by the West to keep the war going. So there's nothing really driving him to settle. The Europeans certainly are encouraging him to continue. So yes, of course we should say that it should end, but actually, we're unable to kind of speak, with calm voices to Zelensky and say, well, actually, an end will be painful. An end to the war will be painful. Ukraine will emerge in a battered state, having lost territory de facto, controlled by the Russians and all the rest of it, having lost all those people, its economy shattered, its energy grid destroyed, largely destroyed. It will be terribly devastating. But the idea of a total defeat of Russia is a fantasy, without a bigger European war, which has never looked likely. So we just need to have that moral and intellectual honesty about it, but no one's prepared to do that, and I think that's where we are now. Of course, it's wrong, but that's where we are now, and I think Putin's just biding his time. Yeah, he would settle, he wants to settle, but all these kind of calls for a ceasefire, I mean, that's not what he wants. He wants NATO off the table, as you say, he wants Ukraine demilitarized and so on. There's no evidence at all. There's never been any evidence, that he wants to conquer all of Ukraine and just have a USA style Iraq type insurgency sort of thing to deal with for a generation to come. He doesn't want that. Occupying the Russian speaking parts of Ukraine. You know, even if that is a morally repugnant thing for him to do. I mean, that's what he wants to achieve and take NATO off the table. And if he can do that, then his popularity ratings in Russia will be sky high, and he's going to keep, as you say, going at a low attritional tempo until Europe is bled dry. I mean, that's just how I see it. But should the Europeans call it to a halt? Of course they should. But I can't. I've seen no evidence that they're prepared to do that. No evidence at all, and it saddens me. Because you talk about diplomacy. Well, there has been no diplomacy. The Europeans that have been talking for 6 months about, well, which of us is going to be the one who talks to Putin, and they can't even decide. And they have that's who talks to Putin, is still under consideration, let alone what they're going to discuss. It's tragic, and Ukraine is suffering, and yeah, that's where we are. But I mean, calm analysis is what's needed. I mean, your sort of thorough, look into the data, the real data. No data sources is 100%, of course, but I mean, taking a cool, calm look at it and all the kind of various bits of reporting that you analyze as well as part of your studies. I mean, that these are all helpful insights. Insights to drive policy. I mean, policy without insight is just well, what is it? I mean, it's just making things up as you go along. It's a policy of fantasizing about what we want rather than what we can achieve. And that's unfortunately the sad state that we've got to in the UK because of our fundamental lack of capability to develop good foreign and security policy. I'm afraid to say, but tragic. But there we have it.
My concluding thought would be that yes, what I am looking at is not at all comforting. It's not a space that I like to be in, but somebody has to look at it. Um, but that nonetheless, as I mentioned before, the UK doesn't make tanks anymore, and again, goodness knows how that happened, but it did. And so therefore we need to look at these things again more carefully if not just we want to help Ukraine, but if we want to help ourselves, and if we want to understand what for the UK and other NATO countries to continue to be competitive and defend themselves in the international security environment, what they would need to succeed. But the sort of diplomacy that you've mentioned is all about, at best, tinkering around the edges, which is what I think um, others don't are so far reluctant to do in the way you very articulately described, and they don't want to do as the character of Tancredi from the novel The Leopard says when he's asked by his uncle, "Why are you associating with these sorts of people?" And he says, "Because if I don't, there will be a revolution and they'll declare a republic. If we want things to stay as they are, things have to change." And that ultimately would be my message. If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change. And that therefore does not mean continuing to insist that at this current rate, with the Russians still improving their provisions of precision munitions and other equipment of death to their troops who are able to use it very effectively, that the Ukrainians continue fighting this war. It's not good for Ukraine, and it's not good for us. But well, I'm very grateful for the opportunity you gave me to speak, but we will see if that thinking spreads.
Well,
Be optimistic.
let's hope that it does. Let's hope that it does. And yeah, you talk about tanks, and briefly, I mean, the Challenger 3 isn't even a new tank. It's just the Challenger 2 hull with a new turret, and they can't even build that on time. Good heavens above. Yeah, I mean, and as I've said many times, I mean, Europe has to either choose war with Russia or peace, and that, because a general war, ironically, would probably bring peace, quicker, not through a major victory by one side over the other, but by focusing the minds of the elites in Europe on the need for a negotiated settlement. Because it's not our troops fighting. There's been that rather shameful, I have to say, lack of urgency about bringing it to a close. Because Ukrainian men and some women are dying, and not our men and women, then there's been a shameful lack of urgency, around bringing it to a close. If it was our troops, I mean, when I was in Afghanistan, we were losing 3 to 4, 5 people a week, in Afghanistan, and we had all the parades at Walbert and Bassett when the planes would come back with the coffins, and the Royal British Legion would be there with the flags for 3, 4, 5 men or women a week. Imagine we're getting 100 British soldiers killed every week in a general war against Russia. That would force a much quicker negotiated settlement, through diplomatic means, which have been completely lacking. And I think that is a
Mm.
difference. We're helping Zelensky fight to the last Ukrainian, because we don't have to fight to the last Brit. And that's a shamefaced reality of it, I'm afraid. But that's how I see it. And that's just the utter degradation of the politics of our societies in Europe that we've ended up in today, I'm sad to say. But anyway, optimism. We need optimism, Alexander. So thanks very much for joining us today. It's very rare you get somebody who brings real evidence and expertise into the debate about the war in Ukraine. So that Alexander, I'm glad they reached out to him. Somebody having spotted him on X doing his presentation in Finland, and in getting a bit of pushback, I understand, from the audience at the time, but possibly. Yeah, I'm not surprised necessarily by that, but we need more people like you actually looking at the evidence and taking a cool clinical view, about what that means for the strategy. So thank you for all you do. Thank you everybody for watching. Please like and subscribe if you found this a helpful video. Wherever you are in the world, I wish you very much peace. And Alexander, thanks very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much.